If you step outside onto a crowded city street and look closely at the sea of faces passing by, you are witnessing an absolute biological anomaly, a strange, lonely baseline that we completely take for granted, because every single person you see belongs to the exact same evolutionary branch, meaning our modern world is uniquely, unnaturally empty of human diversity. Rewind the cosmic clock by just 50,000 years, and you would find yourself walking through a landscape that looked more like a crowded family reunion than a solitary island, a world where Homo sapiens shared the forests, the rivers, and the mountain passes, with a dizzying variety of other human species, all of them completely distinct, all of them walking upright, and many of them living, hunting, and raising families at the exact same moment in time. Some of these long-lost relatives looked so remarkably similar to us that if you dressed them in modern clothes and placed them on a subway car, you might simply mistake them for a distant cousin, while others possessed physical structures so radically different, so intensely adapted to environments we could never endure without high-tech gear, that they challenge our very definition of what it means to be human. There were heavy-boned giants built to absorb the crushing physical trauma of close-quarters hunting, tiny island-bound populations who shrank down over generations until fully grown adults stood no taller than a modern 3-year-old, and mysterious phantom lineages that left behind so little physical evidence that nearly everything we know about them traces back to a single microscopic fragment of a finger bone recovered from a remote cave in Siberia. Yet today the silence across the planet is absolute, leaving only our own species behind to look back at the empty chairs of the family tree and wonder what truly happened to the rest of the human family, a mystery that is routinely brushed aside by tidy, oversimplified textbook narratives about the survival of the fittest, as if there were a singular, obvious rulebook for evolutionary success and our ancestors were simply the only ones smart enough to read the fine print, when the real history is infinitely slower, more tragic, and far messier than a sudden dramatic extinction event. To unravel the true mechanics of how we became the lonely rulers of this planet, we have to examine these lost branches one by one, and the journey must begin with the absolute titan of human history, a species that held onto the planet for so long that our own modern existence looks like a brief, insignificant spark by comparison: Homo erectus. First appearing in the deep fossil record roughly 2 million years ago, Homo erectus is the true anchor of the human lineage, and it is worth letting that number truly settle into your consciousness, because every single historical event you have ever learned about, from the construction of the pyramids to the launch of satellites into deep space, fits comfortably inside a tiny sliver of the last few thousand years, whereas Homo erectus was actively exploring the wilderness, tending fires and raising generations of children for a span of time so unimaginably vast that our entire modern chronicle reads like a brief footnote hastily stapled to the very end of their story. Their bodies were the very first in the evolutionary line to look genuinely, unmistakably familiar, discarding the old ape-like proportions of earlier hominins and adopting long, elegant legs explicitly built for covering immense distances on foot, shorter arms no longer optimized for swinging through the trees, sun-baked terrain. This anatomical transformation is precisely what turned Homo erectus into the ultimate pioneers, the very first human species to pack up its tools and permanently exit the African continent, solving a monumental survival puzzle that no ancestor had ever cracked before: how to adapt, thrive, and maintain a lineage in environments completely alien to the tropical landscapes where their bodies had originally evolved. While their cranial capacity was noticeably smaller than ours, their brains were vastly larger than any creature that had walked the earth before them, providing them with the cognitive flexibility to construct a stone toolkit centered around a beautifully napped, teardrop-shaped stone hand axe that stayed in near-constant production across 3 separate continents for well over 1 million years, marking what is arguably the most successful, enduring piece of human technology in the entire history of our planet. They did not change the hand axe because they didn't need to. It was an evolutionary masterpiece, an all-purpose tool that functioned perfectly for butchering massive game and processing raw materials across wildly diverse environments, meaning there was never an intense, immediate survival pressure forcing them to discard a design that was already keeping them fed and safe. The incredible geographic reach of this species shows up with profound clarity at an archaeological site in Dmanisi in the nation of Georgia, where some of the oldest Homo erectus remains ever discovered outside Africa were pulled from the earth, completely revolutionizing our understanding of the human timeline and proving that they were navigating unfamiliar climates far earlier and with far greater confidence than anyone had assumed possible. Furthermore, deep within their ancient campsites, researchers have uncovered undeniable evidence that certain populations of Homo erectus had achieved one of the greatest milestones in all of biology: the controlled use of fire. By harnessing the flame for warmth through cold northern nights, using its light to deter deadly apex predators, and using its heat to cook their food, they unlocked a massive metabolic shortcut because cooked food requires significantly less energy for the body to digest while delivering far more usable calories, a nutritional windfall that effectively allowed their digestive tracts to shrink over time, freeing up vast reserves of metabolic energy that their bodies could immediately reallocate toward growing a larger, more complex brain. Yet, even a species constructed this perfectly, an absolute titan of endurance that outlasted nearly every climate shift the planet could throw, and it eventually found its road narrowing to a definitive point, with their final surviving populations believed to have become isolated on the tropical island of Java. Cut off from the Asian mainland by rising sea levels, these final groups were trapped in a classic evolutionary bottleneck, surrounded by water with absolutely no way to reach other human populations, no influx of fresh genetic diversity, and no new territories left to explore. As the global climate shifted, the open landscapes they had spent hundreds of thousands of years mastering transformed into shrinking forests, causing the game animals they relied on to grow increasingly scarce. Trapped on an island that could no longer support their traditional way of life, a lineage that had proudly walked the earth for nearly 2 million years quietly ran out of options, fading away not in a dramatic flash of violence but through a slow, silent process of attrition, where fewer and fewer children made it to adulthood. Their most recent fossil remains placed their final stand somewhere around 110,000 years ago, though that exact boundary line continues to shift as scientific dating methodologies grow more refined. Regardless of the precise century, the sweeping reality remains unchanged. After outlasting nearly everything the planet could throw at them, the legendary lineage of Homo erectus finally vanished, leaving behind nothing but their stone handaxes locked forever in the silent layers of the soil. As the sun was setting on the long empire of Homo erectus, another human species was rising to dominate the rugged landscapes of Europe and Western Asia, a population that is quite possibly the most deeply misunderstood and unfairly maligned group in the entire human chronicle, the Neanderthals. For the better part of the last 2 centuries, popular culture reduced these ancient people to the status of dim-witted, stooped, ape-like brutes who were simply too stupid to compete with the graceful arrival of Homo sapiens, a widespread stereotype that turns out to be entirely completely false the very moment you look at the physical and archaeological evidence with genuine scientific objectivity. In truth, Neanderthal bodies were absolute marvels of biological engineering, constructed from the ground up to endure some of the most punishing, hostile glacial environments our planet has ever generated, possessing broad, powerful, barrel-like chest cavities, exceptionally dense bone structures, massive muscle attachments, and an oversized nasal cavity designed explicitly to warm freezing Arctic air before it ever reached their lungs. Their brains were not small or primitive. In fact, on a pure volumetric average, Neanderthal brains were actually slightly larger than the brains of modern humans today. They were hyper-specialized apex ambush predators who hunted massive, terrifying Ice Age megafauna at exceptionally close range using heavy wooden spears, a dangerous hunting strategy that required immense physical courage and left its mark clearly on their skeletons, which show a staggering pattern of healed bone fractures that almost perfectly match the exact injury profiles modern doctors see when treating professional rodeo riders. The deeper we dig into their ancient territory, the more the old, brutish stereotypes completely evaporate, replaced by a picture of a deeply sensitive, intelligent human being who mastered the control of fire, engineered highly complex compound tools, and left behind clear evidence of deliberate, compassionate behavior. At multiple independent sites, researchers have uncovered Neanderthal skeletons, showing signs of severe, debilitating injuries that had beautifully healed decades before the individual died, providing undeniable proof that these communities did not abandon their wounded, but actively carried them, fed them, and protected them for years, demonstrating a profound level of social empathy and moral care. Furthermore, there is a rapidly growing body of evidence showing that Neanderthals were the very first humans to deliberately bury their dead, treating the passing of a community member as a moment of profound significance. Most beautifully illustrated at a burial site in the Shanidar cave in modern-day Iraq, where a Neanderthal skeleton was recovered surrounded by dense clusters of ancient flower pollen, leading some prominent researchers to argue that this ancient individual had been laid to rest on a carefully prepared bed of wild flowers chosen explicitly for their medicinal and aesthetic qualities, even though skeptical scientists counter that the pollen could have been introduced naturally by wind or tunneling rodents. The very fact that modern science is engaging in such a nuanced debate over the funeral arrangements of a Neanderthal completely shatters the idea that they were nothing more than unthinking animals. Their resourcefulness extended far beyond the old caricature of primitive cavemen who only ate raw mammoth meat, because coastal excavations have turned up clear evidence of Neanderthals harvesting shellfish, while the chemical analysis of tartar locked onto their fossilized teeth has revealed a remarkably varied diet that included cooked wild grains and processed root vegetables, proving they were deeply attuned to the rhythms of whatever landscape they occupied. For over 300,000 years, Neanderthals were the undisputed masters of the European continent. But their world changed forever roughly 45,000 years ago, when early populations of Homo sapiens began migrating into the exact same geographical territory. What followed was not a swift, genocidal war, but a complex, prolonged period of overlapping contact where the two species lived close enough to recognize each other as fellow humans and occasionally have children together. A historic encounter that left a permanent mark on our modern biology, which is why almost every single human being alive today, whose ancestral roots trace outside of sub-Saharan Africa, still carries between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA locked directly inside their living genome. However, sharing a landscape with Homo sapiens introduced an intense pressure that the small, isolated Neanderthal populations were ultimately ill-equipped to handle over the long term. Because, while both human species were hunting the exact same herds of megafauna, Homo sapiens possessed a distinct social advantage. They lived in significantly larger, more fluid communities that maintained wide, long-distance trade and social networks stretching across hundreds of miles. These sprawling networks functioned as a brilliant form of evolutionary insurance, because if a local band of Homo sapiens hit a catastrophic winter, they could easily rely on distant connected groups to share food reserves and pass along crucial survival information, whereas Neanderthal communities appeared to remain small, deeply isolated, and intensely insular. High-resolution genetic mapping of Neanderthal remains recovered from a remote cave in the Altai Mountains revealed a local population with such profoundly low genetic diversity that it closely resembled an endangered, inbred group, already sliding toward a natural demographic collapse, meaning that these small, scattered bands had an exceptionally difficult time absorbing the shock of a single bad hunting season, let alone a wildly volatile climate that began swinging violently between brutal cold snaps and brief warming periods. By roughly 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals completely disappeared from the physical fossil record, sliding into extinction not because of a single afternoon of violence, but through a slow, agonizing process of demographic erasure, where their territory was gradually fragmented, their birth rates fell below their death rates, and their remaining numbers were slowly absorbed into the vast expanding ocean of the Homo sapiens population. Yet they never truly vanished entirely, because the segments of their DNA that we still carry inside our bodies today are active, functioning pieces of genetic software that continue to influence how our immune systems defend against modern pathogens, how our nervous systems process physical pain, and even how efficiently our bodies adapt to freezing weather, meaning that a proud human lineage that faded from the Earth 40 millennia ago is still quietly running small pieces of software inside billions of living bodies today. As our understanding of the Neanderthals has transformed, science has simultaneously pulled back the curtain on an even more mysterious, phantom branch of the human family tree, a sister species that we can barely see in the literal sense, because their entire discovery represents an absolute triumph of modern genetic science over standard skeletal anatomy, the Denisovans. In 2008, archaeologists working inside the historic Denisova cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia recovered an incredibly tiny fragment of a hominin bone, a piece so small it could rest comfortably on the tip of a modern adult's pinky finger. And when advanced geneticists managed to extract beautifully preserved DNA from its core, the computational results completely shocked the scientific world, revealing a genome that did not match Homo sapiens or Neanderthals, but belonged to a completely unknown branch of the human family. Perhaps the most astonishing artifact ever pulled from the soil of that cave was a tiny bone fragment belonging to a 13-year-old teenage girl who lived roughly 90,000 years ago, an individual now known as Denny. And when researchers ran her genome, they discovered she was a first-generation hybrid possessing a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father, providing absolute proof that these separate human lineages were actively meeting, communicating, and sharing lives in the overlapping borderlands of their territories. Even though we lack a complete skeleton or a single preserved skull of a Denisovan, their genetic legacy continues to actively shape the modern world, with their unique ancestry showing up clearly across indigenous populations throughout parts of Asia and Oceania, and reaching an astonishing concentration in parts of Melanesia, where modern individuals carry as much as 6% Denisovan DNA locked within their cells, up on the roof of the world. Modern Tibetan populations owe their very survival to a specific Denisovan gene known as EPAS1, a highly specialized genetic mutation that alters how the human body processes oxygen, allowing them to live, work, and raise healthy children at extreme high altitudes where a normal human body would suffer severe altitude sickness and eventually experience systemic cardiovascular failure. As a distinct living population, the Denisovans appear to have quietly faded out of the fossil record somewhere around 30,000 years ago, because while their geographic range may have originally stretched across a massive portion of the Asian continent, their overall population density was likely exceptionally thin, leaving them highly vulnerable to the same grinding demographic forces that claimed the Neanderthals when environmental conditions began to turn against them. It is a deeply humbling realization to accept that we still do not actually know what a Denisovan looked like in life, making them less a species we have physically studied through the classic tools of anatomy, and more a phantom population we have masterfully inferred through the complex mathematics of DNA sequencing, built out of fragments and deep genetic codes rather than bones anyone has actually held up to the light. Yet their genetic internal complexity continues to expand with every new study, as researchers have recently identified clear evidence that there were at least 2, and possibly 3 genetically distinct lineages of Denisovans living across different regions of Asia, all of whom interbred with our migrating ancestors at entirely different points in prehistory, meaning that this single microscopic pinky bone opened a massive doorway into an evolutionary family tree that is infinitely larger, more intricate, and more beautifully complicated than anyone ever anticipated. While these phantom giants were navigating the vast expanses of the Asian continent, one of the strangest, most deeply surreal chapters in the entire human story was quietly unfolding on a remote sun-drenched island in Southeast Asia. In 2003, an international team of local archaeologists excavating the limestone cavern of Liang Bua on the Indonesian island of Flores pulled a skeleton from the damp clay that completely defied every established law of human anthropology. The remains belonged to a fully grown adult female human who stood barely 3 feet tall, possessing a cranial capacity roughly the size of a grapefruit. A brain size that was closer to a primitive chimpanzee than any modern human. The early scientific skepticism surrounding the find was incredibly intense, with many prominent global researchers aggressively arguing that the bones could not possibly represent a new species but were simply the remains of a modern Homo sapiens who suffered from a severe growth disorder. But as the meticulous excavation continued to clear away the dirt, the remains of multiple independent individuals came to light, all displaying the exact same miniature proportions, making the case absolutely impossible to dispute. This was a distinct, completely unique human species, formerly named Homo floresiensis, though the global media immediately branded them with a nickname that stuck instantly: the Hobbit. This miniature human species managed to carve out a highly successful existence on their isolated island home alongside terrifying Komodo dragons and specialized dwarf elephants, a bizarre ecosystem that makes perfect sense once you understand the powerful evolutionary mechanics of island isolation, where a predictable biological pattern known as insular dwarfism takes hold. Shrinkage massive animals over generations because smaller bodies require significantly less food to survive. Their fossil record shows they were actively tool-making and hunting on the island until somewhere around 50,000 years ago, which happens to be the exact chronological window when modern Homo sapiens were first beginning to expand into the region and on an island that small. A tiny specialized population facing the sudden introduction of new ecological pressure or a subtle shift in the delicate island climate can simply run out of time and quietly dissolve into the past. The beautiful wild islands of Southeast Asia were hiding more than one evolutionary surprise of this nature, because in 2019, inside the Callao Cave on the northern island of Luzon in the Philippines, researchers uncovered the fossilized remains of an entirely different small-bodied human species that was formerly named Homo luzonensis. Much like the tiny hobbits of Flores, these ancient humans had been isolated on their specific island for a massive stretch of time, evolving their own highly distinct skeletal features, including a pronounced dramatic curvature in their hand and foot bones that is traditionally associated with primitive tree-dwelling hominins rather than species that walk exclusively on open ground, raising the deeply fascinating possibility that this island species may have spent a meaningful portion of its daily life moving through the forest canopy, long after nearly every other human lineage on the planet had abandoned that arboreal behavior entirely. 2 separate islands, 2 entirely distinct, small-bodied human species quietly evolving in absolute isolation during the exact same broad window of prehistory, thousands of miles apart from one another. completely shattering the old linear view of human evolution and proving that the geography of Southeast Asia during this era was a vibrant, crowded mosaic holding far more human diversity than anyone even dared to assume a few short decades ago. There is one final branch of the human family that must be woven into this grand tapestry. A population whose recent discovery may be the absolute strangest and most deeply unsettling of all, recovered from a dark cave system just outside of Johannesburg, South Africa, Homo naledi. The underground chambers holding their remains are located deep within the Rising Star cave system, accessible only by navigating through pitch-black vertical chutes and narrow fissures so intensely tight that recovering the fossils required recruiting an elite team of slender cavers small enough to squeeze through rock gaps measuring barely wider than a human shoulder. And when the bones were finally brought up into the light, they revealed a human species possessing a brain roughly one-third the size of our own, paired with a deeply perplexing anachronistic mix of primitive and surprisingly modern skeletal characteristics, including long curved fingers explicitly optimized for climbing rock walls, yet wrists and feet fully engineered for long-distance upright bipedal walking. What has made Homo naledi an absolute puzzle for researchers is the highly controversial, deeply mysterious location of the remains themselves, which were found packed deep within a remote, completely pitch-black chamber that would have been exceptionally difficult to access even during the lifetime of the species. A bizarre reality that has led a number of prominent researchers to aggressively argue that Homo naledi, despite possessing a brain no larger than an orange, may have been deliberately and systematically depositing their dead deep within the darkness of the cave as a form of mortuary practice, a highly complex symbolic behavior that science had long assumed required a massive, large-brained human consciousness to execute. When you line all of these diverse human species up side by side along a single master timeline, a striking detail stands out with immense clarity. They were not neatly separated from one another by hundreds of thousands of years, safely compartmentalized into clean, distinct epochs where one draft of humanity quietly died out before the next version stepped onto the stage. Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis, and Homo naledi were all at various points across prehistory, actively sharing the exact same narrow slice of planetary history with early populations of Homo sapiens, meaning that several of these distinct human lineages were almost certainly alive at the exact same chronological second on the exact same spinning planet, sometimes living within a reasonably short walk of one another, sharing the same major river systems, watching the same herds move across the valleys, and looking up at the exact same night sky. Which brings us right back to the central haunting question that hangs over all of anthropology. If the Earth was once a crowded, vibrant home to so many diverse ways of being human, why are we the absolute last human species left standing on the face of the Earth? The easy, comfortable answer that modern humans instinctively reach for is our raw individual intelligence, the flattering idea that our brains were simply superior, our minds more creative, and our intellects vastly sharper than any of our relatives. But that convenient explanation falls apart almost immediately the very second you test it against the hard archaeological data. Because the Neanderthals were clearly deeply intelligent, the Denisovans successfully adapted to some of the most unforgiving climates on the planet, and Homo erectus outlasted every other human species in history by a massive margin, managing to maintain their lineage for nearly 2 million years. What may have actually separated Homo sapiens from every single one of these vanished relatives was not a grand shift in raw individual brain power, but a unique, highly specific social capability that is much harder to measure directly in the ground. The unique way our species built networks across vast distances, and the way knowledge, once it was learned by a single group, almost never got lost again. Anthropologists who study the long, winding growth of human culture refer to this specific phenomenon as the ratchet effect, a cognitive and social mechanism where once a single band of Homo sapiens figured out a slightly better way to nap a spear point, sew a more wind-resistant garment, or track the seasonal movements of a migrating herd, that brilliant idea did not remain locked inside that single isolated community. It moved leaking outward along their long-distance trade networks, getting copied, shared, adjusted, and actively improved by the next group down the trail, creating a collective cognitive ratchet that kept clicking forward, ensuring that human technology almost never slid backward or vanished once it had been mastered. Homo sapiens did not merely live in cooperative groups. We built resilient networks between groups, and those sprawling social safety nets meant that when one local community hit a catastrophic winter or a localized famine, the vital survival knowledge that community carried had usually already traveled somewhere else along the network, meaning it didn't have to die with them. This extraordinary network flexibility meant our species was rarely locked into a single geographic location or dependent on a single rigid survival strategy, the way a highly isolated, insular population could be. So that when the volatile climate shifted and an entire continent became unlivable, there was almost always another connected group, another specialized set of tools, and another deep body of accumulated knowledge somewhere else in the network to draw from. But long-distance networks and cumulative culture only explain a fraction of this grand evolutionary mystery, because geography mattered immensely, timing mattered, and raw, simple luck, being in the exact right place with just enough numbers at the perfect historical moment, played just as massive a role as any quality we like to point to as a genuine biological advantage. In fact, pure population size itself may have mattered more than almost anything else on this list, because researchers who study small, isolated human groups in more recent history have documented deeply tragic cases where a small community actually lost a complex skill it had completely mastered centuries before, not because the people suddenly forgot how to think or lost their intelligence, but because the group's total population shrank below the critical numerical threshold needed to keep passing that highly specialized skill down reliably from one generation to the next. As a highly complex technique needs enough active teachers, enough available students, and enough daily opportunities to practice before it can become permanently locked into a culture's collective memory. Homo sapiens spread across large, fluid, deeply interconnected populations, rarely dropped below that dangerous demographic threshold, for long ensuring their knowledge vault kept expanding. Whereas Neanderthals, Denisovans, and the small island populations on Flores and Luzon, living in small, fragmented, and deeply isolated bands, were constantly exposed to that exact kind of quiet, accidental loss of vital survival skills, proving that we were absolutely not destined by some cosmic law to be the last human species standing on this planet. We just happened to be the incredibly lucky branch that made it through the bottleneck. None of the other fascinating species on this list were primitive. Early drafts of us, and they were absolutely not stepping stones placed along some tidy, predetermined path leading toward the glorious arrival of Homo sapiens. They were their own independent, highly successful branches of the same grand family tree, each with its own beautiful, unique way of surviving in a hostile world, meaning that for the vast majority of human history, we were only one voice among many, a single branch in a crowded, vibrant forest. But now we are the only one left standing to look back, remember, and tell the story, and the profound fact that we are the ones telling it is itself worth sitting with for a moment. Because every single account of Homo erectus, every scientific theory about why the Neanderthals faded, and every fragment of Denisovan DNA read out of a single finger bone comes exclusively from the one branch that happened to survive, meaning that the others are gone forever, unable to correct our biases, unable to add their own perspective, and unable to tell us what we got completely wrong about them. A poignant reality that changes how we view history, reminding us that the story of the last human species left standing is also necessarily a story written entirely by the lone survivor.